I want you to imagine a peaceful summer night in the historic city of Bath, a place where cobblestone streets meet centuries-old architecture, where life carries a certain charm. The kind of town where people felt safe walking home under the glow of the streetlights, where danger seemed a world away. It was June 9th, 1984, a night like any other, or so everyone thought. Welcome to True Crime and Shadows, where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature and explore the chilling stories that often go untold. If you're fascinated by real-life mysteries, chilling crimes, and the secrets that lurk in the shadows, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Your support helps keep these tales alive, and I can't wait to take you on this journey into the unknown. Thanks for joining me, and let's uncover the truth together. 17-year-old Melanie Rode had spent the evening laughing and dancing with friends at Beau Nash nightclub. She was young, vibrant, and full of promise, a life just beginning to unfold. She left the club at 1:30 in the morning, taking a familiar path home to her family. It was just a short walk, 1.5 miles. But Melanie never made it. By the time the sun rose over the city, the peace that Bath had always known was shattered. Her body was discovered on a quiet residential street, a horrific crime that sent shockwaves through the community. She had been brutally attacked, her life taken in an act of unthinkable violence. What followed was a massive investigation, one of the largest this city had ever seen. The police worked tirelessly, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and searching for the person responsible. They had a crucial piece of the puzzle: DNA left behind by the killer. But in 1984, DNA technology was in its infancy, and the killer's identity remained a mystery. Decades passed, and for 30 long years, Melanie's family and friends lived with the agony of not knowing who had taken her from them. The case grew cold, but it was never forgotten. And then in 2014, a routine DNA test cracked the case wide open. A name finally emerged, a man who had spent 3 decades hiding in plain sight. This is the story of Melanie Rode. It's a story of loss, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice. As we retrace her final steps and uncover the truth that took decades to come to light, I want to ask you this. Should we ever stop pursuing justice, no matter how much time has passed? Let me know what you think in the comments. But first, let's go back to that fateful morning when the nightmare began. As dawn broke over the city of Bath on June 9th, 1984, it seemed like the start of any other day. The streets were quiet, bathed in the soft golden light of the early morning. Birds chirped in the distance, and the milkman began his rounds, delivering bottles to doorsteps in the serene residential neighborhood of St. Stephen's Court. But as he turned onto a small pathway just off the main road, he noticed something unusual, a shape lying on the ground. At first, he thought it might be someone asleep or even just discarded belongings. But as he drew closer, he realized the truth was far graver. A young girl walking to meet a friend joined him, and together they approached cautiously. What they saw would stay with them forever. There, on the cold pavement, was the lifeless body of Melanie Rode. She was just 17 years old. Her clothes were disheveled, and there were clear signs of a violent struggle. Blood pooled around her, staining the cobblestones. The sheer brutality of the attack was evident. Melanie had been stabbed repeatedly, the blows delivered with shocking force. The young milkman froze for a moment, paralyzed by the horror before him. It was clear this wasn't an accident or some tragic misstep. Someone had done this to her, and whoever it was had vanished into the night. The police were called immediately, and within minutes, the quiet neighborhood was flooded with officers and investigators. The crime scene was cordoned off as forensic teams worked meticulously, searching for clues. Every detail mattered. The position of her body, the items scattered near her, the footprints in the dirt, and most importantly, the DNA evidence left behind by the killer. Melanie's family was notified. Their world turned upside down in an instant. Just hours earlier, they had been expecting her to walk through the front door, her laughter filling their home. Instead, they were greeted by detectives bearing the unthinkable news. Word of the murder spread quickly through the close-knit community of Bath. Parents held their children a little tighter that morning, and people locked their doors in broad daylight. This was not the sort of crime that happened here. Bath was a historic city, known for its Roman baths and Georgian architecture, not for acts of violence like this. The idea that a young girl could be so savagely attacked while walking home was almost too much to comprehend. Fear gripped the city. People whispered about the screams heard in the early hours of the morning. Some claimed they had seen a figure lurking in the shadows near the nightclub, but no one had any concrete answers. The questions weighed heavily on everyone's minds. Who had done this? Were they still nearby? Could it happen again? The immediate aftermath of Melanie's murder sent shockwaves through Bath, changing the way people viewed their once peaceful community. The streets that had always felt safe now seemed menacing. The neighbors who once smiled at each other in passing now eyed each other with suspicion. If you were living in Bath during that time, how do you think you would have felt knowing such a brutal crime had occurred just steps from your door? Would you have changed your routines? Would you have looked at strangers differently? Let me know in the comments below. But as fear spread, so did determination. The police launched a massive investigation, vowing to bring Melanie's killer to justice. What they uncovered would paint a chilling picture of the events leading up to that tragic morning and set the stage for a 30-year quest for answers. To truly understand the tragedy that unfolded, we must first look at the events leading up to Melanie Rhodes' final moments. It was Friday night, June 8, 1984, a night meant for fun and laughter, the kind of evening every teenager dreams of. For Melanie, it was no different. Melanie was 17 years old, bright, full of life, and deeply loved by her family and friends. That evening, she and her close friends decided to go out to Beau Nash, a popular nightclub in Bath. It was a place that attracted young people from all over the area, a spot where the music was loud, the dance floor was alive, and the worries of the world seemed far away. Melanie arrived at the club dressed in the fashion of the time, her smile lighting up the room. She spent the night dancing and chatting, surrounded by friends. Witnesses later recalled how happy she seemed, carefree, vibrant, and very much in her element. As the night wore on, the crowd at Beau Nash began to thin. By 1:30 a.m., Melanie decided it was time to head home. She said her goodbyes and left the club alone, intending to make the short walk back to her family's home in Lansdowne. It was a route she knew well, a mile and a half through familiar streets. The path Melanie chose took her through the heart of Bath, past its historic buildings and quiet residential neighborhoods. It was late, but the city was still alive in its own way. Streetlights illuminated her path, casting long shadows on the cobblestones. But as Melanie walked, she wasn't alone. Somewhere along the way, she was being followed. Witnesses reported hearing screams in the early hours of the morning. One neighbor, who lived near St. Stephen's Court, described being woken by the sound of a girl's voice, desperate, terrified. But in the stillness of the night, the cries seemed distant, and no one could pinpoint their source. Another resident recalled hearing hurried footsteps and what sounded like a struggle, but when they looked outside, they saw nothing. What happened next was swift and violent. At some point along her route, Melanie's attacker struck, dragging her into the secluded area where her body was later found. It was here that she was brutally assaulted and stabbed multiple times. As the hours passed and the city of Bath slept, Melanie lay there alone. The vibrant, happy girl who had been dancing with friends just hours earlier was now a victim of unspeakable violence. When Melanie didn't return home, her family began to worry. She was responsible and had never been one to stay out all night without letting someone know. But the news of her murder wouldn't reach them until later that morning, delivered by detectives at their doorstep, a moment that changed their lives forever. This series of events raises questions that are still relevant today. Walking home late at night is something many of us have done, often without thinking twice about it. But in moments like these, we're reminded of the risks involved. If you were in Melanie's shoes, would you have made the same decision to walk home alone? And more importantly, what precautions do you think should be taken to stay safe during late-night walks? Share your thoughts in the comments below. But as we reflect on Melanie's final hours, we must now turn to the investigation that followed, a desperate search for answers in a community forever changed by her loss. The investigation into Melanie Rhodes' murder began almost immediately after her body was discovered. St. Stephen's Court became a hive of activity as police officers cordoned off the area. Forensic teams scoured the scene, and detectives began piecing together the tragic events of that night. The crime scene itself was both a critical starting point and a haunting reminder of the brutality Melanie endured. Forensic experts worked tirelessly to collect every possible piece of evidence: her clothing, the ground beneath her, the blood spatter patterns, and most crucially, biological evidence left by her killer. Even in 1984, DNA technology was in its infancy. Scientists understood its potential, but lacked the tools to fully utilize it. Still, the DNA collected from the scene was carefully preserved, stored with the hope that one day, advancements in technology would allow it to reveal the identity of Melanie's killer. In the weeks that followed, detectives launched a massive effort to find the person responsible. Hundreds of people were interviewed, including Melanie's friends, nightclub patrons, and residents of the Lansdowne area. Flyers were distributed, and appeals were made to the public for information. Witnesses reported hearing screams and seeing suspicious figures near the nightclub, but no one could provide a clear description of the perpetrator. Investigators believed the killer may have followed Melanie from Beau Nash, waiting for the right moment to strike. Despite their best efforts, the trail quickly grew cold. The lack of advanced forensic technology meant that even with a DNA profile, there was no way to match it to a suspect without someone already in custody. The National DNA Database, which would eventually play a key role in solving the case, didn't exist at the time. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the investigation slowed. New leads became scarce, and the case was officially labeled as cold. But for Melanie's family, the nightmare never ended. Her parents, siblings, and friends were left with a void that could never be filled. Melanie's mother often spoke of the pain of not knowing who had taken her daughter from her, of the countless sleepless nights spent imagining the terror Melanie must have felt. Her father, a proud man, struggled to accept that someone had gotten away with such a horrific crime. The community of Bath was also deeply affected. Melanie's murder cast a long shadow over the city, shattering the sense of safety its residents once took for granted. Parents warned their children to avoid walking alone at night. People who had never thought twice about their neighbors began locking their doors and looking over their shoulders. For decades, the case remained unsolved, a lingering wound for everyone who knew Melanie or followed the story. Detectives revisited it periodically, hoping for a breakthrough. But time and time again, they were met with dead ends. And yet, hope persisted. The DNA evidence collected in 1984 was a ticking time bomb, silent, waiting, and ready to speak when science finally caught up. By the 1990s, DNA technology had advanced significantly, and the National DNA Database was established in the UK. Investigators submitted the sample from Melanie's case, but there was still no match. Every passing year brought new advancements, but for Melanie's family, it also brought more pain. Birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries of her death came and went. The world moved on, but for those who loved Melanie, life was forever divided into before and after. The question lingers. Could anything more have been done at the time? Could the police have taken a different approach, or were they simply limited by the tools and knowledge available in 1984? What do you think? Should investigators have handled things differently back then, or was the lack of technology the ultimate roadblock? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's fast forward to 2014, a year that would change everything. After 30 long years, the silence was finally broken. By 2014, 3 decades had passed since Melanie Rhodes' life was brutally cut short. Her murder had faded from the headlines, and for many, the case was just another unsolved tragedy. But behind the scenes, forensic technology had been quietly evolving, reaching levels of precision and sophistication that were unimaginable in 1984. In June of that year, an extraordinary breakthrough would bring Melanie's killer to light. The turning point came from an unexpected source, a routine DNA sample. Christopher Hampton's daughter, who had been involved in a minor offense, was required to provide her DNA for the UK's national database. This ordinary act, seemingly unrelated to any major crime, became the key to unlocking one of the country's most haunting cold cases. When her DNA was processed, it flagged a familial match to the DNA profile preserved from Melanie's murder scene. It was a moment of profound significance. After 30 years of dead ends, investigators finally had a lead. Police acted swiftly, tracing the match back to Christopher Hampton, a man who had never been on their radar. At 63 years old, Hampton was living a quiet, unremarkable life in Bristol, just a short distance from Bath. A married father of 3, he worked as a painter and decorator and had spent the past 3 decades blending seamlessly into his community. The contrast between the man he appeared to be and the monstrous act he had committed was staggering. While Melanie's family endured decades of grief and uncertainty, Hampton had gone about his life, building a family, maintaining a career and evading justice. Detectives meticulously gathered evidence, determined to ensure that Hampton couldn't escape accountability again. They monitored his movements, conducted background checks, and reviewed his history. Hampton, who had no prior convictions, seemed like the last person anyone would suspect. When the police finally knocked on his door, Hampton's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Confronted with the DNA evidence linking him to Melanie's murder, he initially denied any involvement. But as investigators presented the overwhelming proof, the weight of his lies became too much to bear. Hampton eventually confessed to the crime, admitting that he had followed Melanie that fateful night and attacked her with unimaginable violence. The revelation was both shocking and cathartic. For years, Melanie's family had been tormented by the thought that her killer might never be found. Now, they knew his name, his face, and the truth about what he had done. Hampton's arrest also reignited public debate about the power of DNA technology. The fact that a single sample from his daughter had unraveled a 30-year-old mystery was nothing short of remarkable. It highlighted the importance of preserving evidence, the advancements in forensic science, and the enduring commitment of law enforcement to seek justice, no matter how much time had passed. But the story also raised difficult questions. How had Hampton managed to evade detection for so long? Was it luck, a failure of the initial investigation, or simply the limitations of the time? And what about his family? Had they ever suspected the darkness lurking beneath his seemingly ordinary exterior? It's astonishing to think that someone could live a normal life for over 30 years while carrying the weight of such a heinous crime. Does this surprise you? And what are your thoughts on the role DNA plays in modern investigations? Let us know in the comments. As the walls closed in on Hampton, the focus shifted to his trial, a moment Melanie's family had waited 3 long decades to see. Justice, at last, was within reach. When police finally closed in on Christopher Hampton, the man behind Melanie Rhodes' murder, the details of his life stunned everyone. He wasn't a career criminal, nor was he someone who had spent years evading the law by constantly looking over his shoulder. Instead, Hampton was a married father of 3, living a quiet and seemingly respectable life in Bristol. He had built a stable existence for himself, working as a painter and decorator. To his neighbors and colleagues, he was an ordinary man, a man who attended community events, raised his children, and maintained his home. For over 30 years, Hampton blended into his surroundings so seamlessly that no one, not even his own family, suspected the dark truth about his past. But the DNA evidence didn't lie. When investigators arrived at his home to arrest him, Hampton was caught completely off guard. The life he had carefully constructed was about to unravel. During the initial questioning, Hampton denied any involvement in Melanie Rhodes' murder. He insisted that the police had made a mistake, that there was no way he could be connected to such a horrific crime. But as detectives presented him with the DNA evidence and other details from the case, the cracks in his denial began to show. Eventually, faced with the irrefutable truth, Hampton confessed. He admitted to following Melanie on the night of June 9, 1984. He confessed to attacking her, sexually assaulting her, and stabbing her multiple times. It was a moment of grim vindication for Melanie's family and the investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case. However, Hampton never fully explained his motive. He didn't offer any insight into why he chose Melanie or what drove him to commit such a brutal act. Was it a moment of opportunity? A deeply buried impulse that had surfaced that night? Or something else entirely? His silence on these questions only deepened the mystery surrounding his actions. What made his confession even more unsettling was the life he had led since the murder. After taking Melanie's life, Hampton returned to his own as though nothing had happened. He got married, raised children, and lived a life that outwardly seemed unremarkable. This stark contrast raises an uncomfortable question. How is it possible for someone to commit such a heinous act and then go on to live a normal life? Was he haunted by his crime, or had he somehow compartmentalized it, locking it away in a part of his mind he never revisited? Psychologists often point out that some criminals are adept at masking their guilt, suppressing their memories, or rationalizing their actions to the point where they can function as though nothing is wrong. But what does that say about Hampton? Did his ability to lead a normal life make his crime even more chilling? And what about his family? It's hard to imagine the shock and betrayal they must have felt when they learned the truth. For 30 years, they knew him as a loving husband and father. Did they ever sense that something was off? Or was his mask so convincing that even those closest to him couldn't see through it? The question lingers. Why do some criminals seem able to live normal lives after committing such horrific acts? Is it a sign of deep psychological detachment, or does it reflect a lack of remorse? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As Hampton's confession brought long-awaited answers, it also set the stage for the next chapter, his trial. For Melanie's family, the journey for justice was nearing its conclusion, but the pain of their loss would remain forever. The year was 2016, and after 3 decades of heartbreak, uncertainty, and unanswered questions, the road to justice for Melanie Rode was finally reaching its destination. Christopher Hampton, the man who had taken her life in such a brutal, senseless attack, was about to face the consequences of his actions. But for Melanie's family, no matter the verdict, justice could never truly undo the damage that had been done. The trial took place at Bristol Crown Court in May of 2016. For Melanie's parents, siblings, and friends, it was the moment they had long awaited. The chance to face the man who had stolen so much from them, to hear the words that would bring some form of closure to the agonizing chapter of their lives. But no amount of legal proceedings or courtroom drama could ever erase the grief they carried. During the trial, Melanie's family members bravely took the stand, each of them recounting the profound impact of her loss. They spoke of the vibrant young woman she had been, someone full of promise, someone whose laughter had lit up every room she entered. Her mother, father, and siblings described how they had lived with the pain of her murder, year after year, unsure of whether they would ever see justice served. For them, Melanie's death had not just been the loss of a loved one, but the loss of the future she could have had. The weddings, the children, the milestones that would never come. The courtroom was heavy with emotion as they told their stories. Their voices cracked with grief, and their eyes betrayed the years of sorrow they had endured. It was a reminder that the search for justice is not just about punishing the perpetrator. It's about honoring the lives that have been lost and giving a voice to those who continue to suffer in silence. Meanwhile, Christopher Hampton sat in the dock, having already admitted to the crime. There was no denying his guilt. The DNA evidence, his confession, and the circumstances of the murder left no room for doubt. But even with his guilty plea, his motivations remained a mystery. What had driven him to commit such a vicious and senseless act? Was it a moment of rage, or was it something darker, a compulsion he could no longer control? Hampton's plea of guilty to the murder of Melanie Rode was a formality, but it was still a significant moment in the trial. The legal process had been slow, but now at last he was facing the consequences of his actions. The court heard that Hampton had lived a life free from the criminal justice system for over 3 decades. He had managed to evade the law despite the horror he had inflicted, and now in his 60s, he was finally being held accountable. After the emotional testimonies from Melanie's family, the judge delivered the verdict. Christopher Hampton was sentenced to life imprisonment. But there was a stipulation, a minimum term of 22 years before he would be eligible for parole. It was a sentence that seemed to offer some sense of justice, but for Melanie's family, it could never bring back their daughter, their sister, their friend. The minimum term of 22 years meant that Hampton would likely be in his 80s before he could even begin to consider the possibility of release. For many, this seemed a just punishment, given the heinous nature of the crime. But for Melanie's family, the sentence was both a relief and a reminder of the loss they would carry with them forever. No number of years behind bars could ever undo the pain of losing Melanie. As the courtroom proceedings came to an end, there was a palpable sense of closure for the Rode family. While the court had done its part, justice could never truly be complete. Melanie's absence would remain a wound that time could never heal. But for the first time in 3 decades, the family could finally breathe a little easier, knowing that the man who had taken her life would never again walk free. The journey for Melanie's family was not over, but they could finally begin to move forward, holding onto the memories of their loved one, knowing that justice had at long last been served. But as we reflect on this case, there are still questions that remain. Was Hampton's sentence appropriate for such a brutal, senseless act? Given the impact on Melanie's family, could anything truly have been enough? What are your thoughts? Was justice served? Let us know in the comments below. As the courtroom doors closed and Christopher Hampton was led away, the story of Melanie Rode's murder came to a resolution that had taken over 3 decades to reach. But as the dust settled, it wasn't just the conclusion of this one case that resonated. It was the broader implications of justice, forensic advancements, and the power of hope in the face of unimaginable loss. Melanie's case had become a powerful example of how far forensic science had come in the decades since her murder. Back in 1984, DNA evidence was still in its infancy, only recently starting to make an impact in criminal investigations. The police's inability to match Hampton's DNA to any known suspect back then wasn't due to negligence. It was simply because the technology didn't exist to link him to the crime scene. But fast forward to the 21st century, and advancements in DNA analysis, familial searching, and genetic databases provided a critical breakthrough. Melanie's case proved that justice doesn't always have to be delayed indefinitely. It showed that even after decades of waiting, modern technology could finally bring closure. The impact of forensic advancements cannot be overstated. Forensic science has revolutionized how cold cases are approached, offering a chance for victims and their families to seek justice, no matter how much time has passed. It's a reminder that evidence doesn't simply disappear with time. It waits, preserved, until the technology and determination catch up. Melanie's case serves as a testament to the importance of preserving evidence properly. Forensic scientists who handled the crime scene back in 1984 preserved every vital detail, every piece of DNA, every fiber, every footprint. Without these efforts, justice might have remained out of reach forever. The case became a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, meticulous care and attention to detail can help solve crimes years later. It also highlights the role of hope. For Melanie's family, hope was all they had for over 30 years. Each year that passed without an answer was filled with unbearable grief, unanswered questions, and doubt. The breakthrough in 2014 gave them a renewed sense of purpose, not only because justice was now possible, but because it demonstrated that they weren't forgotten, and that time alone wouldn't erase their loved one's memory. For families of victims, justice is not about retribution. It's about acknowledgement, validation, and recognition of the harm done. The Rode family's emotional testimony during Hampton's trial was not only heart-wrenching, but also empowering. It gave a voice to those who had been silenced by grief for decades. Their loss was made tangible through the justice served, even if it could never undo the pain. This case also prompted broader reflections on how society handles justice for victims of violent crimes. It raised questions about how many other cold cases remain unsolved due to limitations in forensic technology or investigative resources. It emphasized the need for better funding, advanced training for law enforcement, and expanded use of genetic databases to solve crimes. The justice system must continue to evolve, particularly in light of modern forensic innovations. Cases like Melanie's remind us that justice delayed isn't necessarily justice denied. It's simply delayed, often due to limitations in evidence collection, science, and even human error. But every cold case solved brings with it a deeper sense of security and closure for communities affected by violence. Melanie's murder not only left a lasting impact on her family and the city of Bath, it became a turning point in how cold cases are viewed and investigated. It showed that time alone cannot erase evidence or pain. Forensic advancements, when combined with determination and perseverance, offer victims and their loved ones a second chance at justice. As we reflect on Melanie Rode's story, it forces us to consider how justice is perceived, how victims are treated, and how we, as a society, handle the passage of time in criminal investigations. It also reminds us that even after decades, hope should never be abandoned. What do you think is the most important lesson from this case? Let us know in the comments below. As we come to the end of Melanie Rode's heartbreaking and, in the end, hopeful story, we reflect on the key moments that made this case so unforgettable. The brutal murder of a young, vibrant teenager in 1980 shook the city of Bath and left her family in unimaginable pain, uncertain if justice would ever be served. For over 30 years, the case went cold, with nothing but unanswered questions, no clear suspects, and no resolution. But as technology advanced, hope emerged from the ashes. Thanks to modern forensic breakthroughs and the tireless efforts of investigators, Christopher Hampton, who had lived a quiet, unassuming life for decades, was finally brought to justice. The DNA evidence linked him to the crime, and his eventual confession marked the conclusion of a long, painful journey for Melanie's family and the community. The resolution of this case was a testament to the power of forensic science and the unwavering perseverance of those seeking justice. It shows that even the coldest cases are not beyond the reach of modern advancements, and it underscores the importance of preserving evidence, keeping hope alive, and never giving up. As we reflect on this tragic yet redemptive story, I want to thank you for joining me today. Your engagement with these cases helps bring attention to important issues and reminds us that justice, no matter how delayed, is still possible. If you found this story compelling, be sure to subscribe for more true crime stories. There are many more cases where justice was fought for, and some even remain unsolved. Before we go, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Melanie Road case. Do you think justice was truly served? Do you think advancements in forensic science are enough to solve even the oldest cold cases? Let's discuss it. Leave your comments below, and let's continue the conversation. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to sharing more stories with you soon.